Hello students, welcome to Unit 3, where we're going to cover episodes 5, 6, and 7 of the Justice with Michael Sandel video lectures, as well as cover off a few pages of the textbook specifically relating to utilitarianism and Immanuel Kant. I first off want to thank those students who did get their pictures to me. We now have a picture of Benjamin and David and Combrell. Robert sent in a picture and William sent in a picture, and I am still waiting on a picture from Shaniqua. That'll be great when I get that in, and then I'll have one of everybody. And I appreciate your introductions. It helps me get to know you a little better, and it means a lot to me that you took the time to introduce yourselves. So let's start with the Johnson textbook first. What he does in chapter 5 is he covers off 5 different ethical perspectives. What he wants you to do, and he tells you to resist the temptation to select one perspective for decision making while ignoring the others, because what happens is if you say, oh, okay, what I'm doing right now fits into utilitarianism, or hey, this really fits well with Kant. When I covered off the submissions that you gave me for Sunday Summary Week number 2, I covered off the challenges of trying to stay with one perspective alone, and then I summed up that video with somebody who, with Sarah's argument that said libertarianism and utilitarianism are at odds with each other. They're not necessarily opposites, but what works for one doesn't work for the other. And then when we get into Kant, you'll find exactly the same thing. Kant doesn't work very well either. So what we're going to do this week is we're going to get into a modern theory of justice as covered off by John Rawls. And so that's where we're going to end up this week, and John Rawls will be the main focus for next week. So what Johnson covers off in the textbook on these few pages, he starts off explaining utilitarianism, where the objective is to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that's pages 157 to 159. In a sentence, that's the easiest way to sum up utilitarianism. It's oversimplified, but that's the way to capture it in one sentence. And for Kant, the way to capture Kant in one sentence is to say, do what's right, no matter the cost. You'll see how that becomes problematic. So that's the Kant's categorical imperative. Kant had a lot of philosophies, but the categorical imperative is the one that really applies to the ethical argument that we're going to be making here. And that's covered off on page 159 to 161. So before you watch the videos, especially before you watch episodes 6 and 7, make sure you read about Kant. And I'm going to give you a fairly detailed lecture here about Kant, and hopefully you'll have seen this, you'll have taken the time to watch this video before you watch episodes 6 and 7. Let's start off with utilitarianism. Do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It's based on the premise that ethical choices should be based on their consequences. Who's going to be impacted by this choice? Or if there's no harm to anybody, or on the flip side, if you are doing more good to more people this way than doing it that way, and as long as neither one of them still do any harm, then you've satisfied utilitarianism. Utility can be based on what is best in a specific case. So in that case, it's the utilitarianism of the act is what you're looking at. And it can be based on what's generally best in most contexts, which is setting out a rule of utilitarianism. So act-based or rule-based utilitarianism are separate, and it's an interesting way to look at it. 4 steps to conducting a utilitarian analysis of an ethical problem. Number 1, clearly identify the action or issue under consideration. Number 2, specify all those who might be affected by the action, the organization, a local community, a professional group, a society, not just those who are immediately involved in the situation. So you've got to look forward a little bit and say, oh, okay, what are the ramifications in the future for this group of people, for that group of people, for another group of people? Are we missing anybody? Determine the good and bad consequences for those affected, and sum the good and the bad consequences up, and choose that act or that rule which will be best for the greatest good. Applications of utilitarianism are that they build on prior experience. You can carefully examine the outcomes of your decisions. You set personal interests aside when you're doing it, and that's hard. And you recognize when weighing consequences is critical. What Johnson does in the textbook as well is he cautions you against each one of these perspectives. For utilitarianism, the cautions are that the consequences are difficult to identify, measure, and evaluate. And there may be unanticipated outcomes, so you may not be able to forecast or foresee what's coming down the road from these actions. And decision makers reach different conclusions. And so therefore what you attempt to predict, there's never an agreement on what is the probable outcome based on all of the brains that come together to make that decision. When Johnson deals with Kant's categorical imperative, he puts it in a sharp contrast to the utilitarianism. Kant argued that people should do what is morally right no matter what the consequences are. Kant's reasoning was the best known example of deontological ethics. Deontological means what should be. Not what is, that's ontological. Deontological is what should be. And according to Kant, what is right for one is right for everybody. That is the foundational premise of his argument, and if you don't abide by that premise, then you're not going to like Kant anyways. The idea that if you can find out what is the one correct way, the one ethical way, then that's going to be ethical for everybody. And we'll see how that gets into some problems here. Kant's categorical imperative starts with the idea that you are duty-bound by some kind of moral duty. Coming up with what that moral duty is part of parcel of what his whole volumes of writing were all about. What you also have to do is always ask if you would want everyone to make the same choice, and then demonstrate your respect for others. Now, what we're going to look at on the next frame here seems to be diametrically opposed in certain ways about this, and I'm going to go through an argument here before you watch the videos so that you can have this in your mind while you're watching episodes 6 and 7. The cautions that Johnson gives you about Kant's categorical imperative is that there are exceptions for just about every universal law. The moral obligation may conflict with another person's moral obligation. And what Johnson also points out is that Kant demonstrates his philosophy through unrealistic examples. And it's hard to apply, particularly in stressful situations where society feels stressors. What you need to understand about Kant as well is that religious people, Kant was religious. He claimed to be religious, but also keep in mind that if he didn't claim to be religious, he would have been burned at the stake or his head would have been chopped off as a heretic. It wasn't exactly a wonderful time in the late 1700s to be an atheist. But when people look at Kant's writings, nobody can really figure him out, because sometimes he makes these claims to be religious, and other times he seems to be saying, you know what, it's all about autonomy, and you can't be autonomous as an individual if you're forced to abide by a religious authority that has power over you. So religious philosophers and people who interpret the philosophy of that era today are trying to give Kant a negotiated reading so that he fits for their religious views, because people want to hold on to their religions. Jews want to hold on to their religion, Muslims want to hold on to their religion, Christians want to hold on to their religions, Hindus want to hold on to their religions. And so everybody tries to fit, like I mentioned in the one video about the Sunday Summary review, everybody tries to fit their religion into this philosophical view, and because Kant is so famous, and because he actually allows his philosophy to be construed in ways that almost make it attractive to fit religions into his view, then you end up with these negotiated readings. So what I've done to demonstrate this negotiated reading that religions try to give to Kant is I've taken the slide that had these 3 plain and simple points on them, and I've added these words behind each one of the phrases, each one of the bullet points, that allows it to be contextualized for a religious perspective. And you'll see where the conflict comes from. When it says be duty bound, I add the words by the moral obligations of your religion. When it says always ask if you would want everyone to make the same choice, add the words, and that choice is that you strictly abide by the moral obligations of your religion. So I'm going to abide by my religion, and you're going to have to abide by your religion, because we both have really good religions, right? So you're not going to say that they're wrong. Their religion is just fine, my religion is just fine. I'm going to abide by my moral obligations. I'm duty bound by my religion, and you're going to remain duty bound by your religion. And then the final point is demonstrate your respect for others. But what always comes in with a negotiated reading is the qualifier that I will have respect for others who belong to my religion. And other people who don't belong to my religion, well, my religion tells me that they're wrong, so I can't respect them with their erroneous ways, but I will be respectful to people who belong to my religion. But it's really hard to be respectful to people who don't belong to my religion when you see them as on a wrong path to heaven. And so this is where it all falls apart. The negotiated reading doesn't fit into all three of those points. It fits into this one here really well, where it says be duty bound, and I am absolutely duty bound by my religious views. And I expect everybody else to be duty bound by their religious views, but it's really hard to respect them if they don't belong to my religion. And so what happens at that point in time is you end up with a conflict which is demonstrated in a very humorous way by this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. The one saying about Kant that is fairly universally known is the idea that you live your life as though your every act were to become a universal law. But what happens in real life is what happens to Calvin. Calvin is jumping along when he's followed by his tiger, Hobbes, and he says, I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the ends justify the means. Get what you can while the getting's good. That's what I say. Might makes right. And the winners get to write history. These are all sayings that we hear all the time, right? This is what Calvin's going along saying. And then he continues on and he says, it's a dog-eat-dog world. So I'll do whatever I have to and let others argue about whether it's right or not. And so then Hobbes gets behind him and pushes him forward and he falls in the mud. And Calvin says, why did you do that? And Hobbes answers, you were in my way and now you're not. So the ends justified the mean. Calvin, of course, answers, I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt, just me. It's really hard to live your life as though your every act were to become a universal law, because a lot of us want us to say, oh, okay, well, I always want it to be interpreted this way, except for when I don't. And this is what happens today in modern media. The one example that I always return to, because people try and diminish it, and I won't allow it, is the murdering of abortion doctors and the bombing of abortion clinics. The Roe v. Wade decision established law in the United States. A lot of people don't like the law, and their justification for not liking the law is that they want the law of the land to reflect their religious belief system. It just bothers them to no end that other people don't have a religious belief system that tells them in their mind that abortion is murder. But the law of the land says, do you have privacy? It's not about a belief system. The Roe v. Wade decision was about privacy. The privacy of a woman to see her doctor. Dr. Tiller was a doctor, and he had women for patients. And when a woman came to him as a patient, the decision that they made in consultation together has been protected by law in the decision of Roe v. Wade. Nobody else is allowed to interfere in that decision that a woman makes when she consults her doctor. The doctor's advice is respected under the law, and if the law does not prohibit the treatment, then it is legal under the American Constitution. And so that decision was between a woman and her doctor. But Dr. Tiller kept making enemies because people thought they were answering to a higher law. And this is where that ethical decision comes in, that people can't separate, and this is why utilitarianism and Kant's point of view open up room for misinterpretation. So, especially on point number 4, what happened in the case of bombing an abortion clinic and shooting Dr. Tiller in the foyer of his church? Whatever happened to this demonstrate respect for others? And in the United States, a lot of people actually fully agreed with what the killer did. And I refuse to say the killer's name because I don't want to give him any more notoriety than he already has. Bill O'Reilly, if you don't know, is the most watched television show on Fox News network. And Fox News is the most watched television cable news channel in the United States. What he says carries a lot of weight, and what he said carried a lot of weight with people who wanted to go out and say, you know what, I'm going to do what the law won't do. I'm going to take justice into my own hands because I'm answering to a higher law. And they failed to respect others. And does that make Christian extremism in the United States any less extreme than Sharia law that we see in the news right now? How was the murder of George Tiller by a Christian, motivated by Christian theology, any different than the terrorist attack in Paris? Or the terrorist attack in Australia, where they went into the chocolate shop? What you have to do, and this is the hard part, is we have to come up with a philosophical view that says, oh, okay, we've got to figure out, we've got to back up one step, and we've got to figure out a system of justice and fairness that works for everybody, and allows for this pluralism where there are multiple truths and nobody gets to claim a capital T truth, because we're looking for something that's just and fair rather than trying to define a capital T truth that everybody's going to live with. And that's pretty much what John Rawls has done. And so this is where we're going to end the discussion today. I'm going to quickly do a summary of the episodes that you're going to watch today, and then we're going to come back to John Rawls at the end. And that's where Michael Sandel sets us up for next week's episodes that we're going to watch. So episode 5, part 1, talks about the hired guns, and he talks about the Civil War conscription process. Everybody had the equal chance of being conscripted for the Civil War, but if you had money, you could pay somebody else to go fight for you. Episode 5, part 2, talked about motherhood for sale and the legal case of Baby M, which set a precedence in the United States for something that had never been tackled before. Episode 6, part 1, talks about your motives, what motivates you. This is where Kant comes into the philosophy with his book, The Critique of Pure Reason. This is graduate student material, so you don't have to worry about really taking copious notes. I want you to let episode 6 and episode 7 play through. Don't stop them. Take notes for what makes sense to you, and if it doesn't make sense to you, all you really need to know for this course is what's in the textbook in chapter 5. But listen to it, let it play through, and take notes about what makes sense to you, because Dr. Michael Sandel may say something that will prick your memory and inspire your Sunday summary. So just listen to what he says and see if there's anything in there that you want to talk about, or a news story that's been current in your mind that you can bring up for your Sunday summary. But other than that, don't try and understand Kant to the degree that Michael Sandel teaches it. That's graduate student material. What you do have to understand, though, and you should understand, is this is why parents in religious households often have a problem with Kant. I mentioned earlier the negotiated reading of Kant. But it doesn't really lend itself well to that if you actually study Kant the way Michael Sandel teaches Kant. And this is why parents in religious households typically get nervous when their kids are reading Kant, because what Kant really says is, in order to act freely, what that means is that you have to be able to act autonomously. And in order to act autonomously, what that means is that you have to be able to act according to a law which you give yourself. Oh, all of a sudden Peace and Love 1960s sounds like that's what they were reading. And they were. When you hear about the 1960s and everybody was getting into the hippie movement, this is what they were reading. The beatnik generation, they were reading Kant. And it made parents really nervous, because Kant was saying, you know what, go ahead and live autonomously, because there is a higher law that you have to live by, and it has nothing to do with the religion that you were raised in. It's higher than religion. It's a law that's above religion, because religions create all of this conflict. We're looking for a law that's higher than religions that will actually bring a global spirituality into existence. So Kant was spiritual but not religious. 7 out of 10 young adults today in this generation are leaving Christianity and other religions and becoming spiritual but not religious. Most of the surveys that go out, that's the classification where most millennials place themselves, spiritual but not religious. Episode 6, part 2, is talking about the supreme principle of morality. Like I said, this is that law that's above religion, a spirituality, a connection to deity that exists above organized religion. Once again, this is graduate student material. You don't need to dig deep into it. It talks about what is the supreme principle of morality in Kant's view. And what he says is, if the action would be good solely as a means to something else, the imperative is hypothetical. If the action is represented as good in itself, and therefore as necessary for a will which of itself accords with reason, then the imperative is categorical. When it comes up on the screen for the Michael Sandel video, listen closely to what he says about that. If you can get it, that's great. You'll probably use it in your life very, very often. If you don't get it, wait until you're a graduate student to get it. There were 3 areas which Michael Sandel talks about a contrast in Kant's philosophy. When he talks about morality, he talks about motives. What motivates you to act morally? Are you acting morally out of duty, or are you acting morally out of an inclination? It's very different. When he talks about freedom, he's talking about your determination of will. Where does your will come from? Are you acting autonomously, or are you acting heteronomously? And when he talks about reason, this is where the imperative comes in, you know, the reasoning that you put in your brain. Is this a categorical reasoning or a hypothetical reasoning? So those are three different sets of contrasts that exist in the philosophy. What he asks us to do ultimately, but suppose, however, there were something whose existence has in itself an absolute value. This is what I'm talking about when I say Kant doesn't look at a religion, he looks at spirituality as a plane that exists above religion. Okay? This thing whose existence has in itself an absolute value. An end in itself. Are we a good human race? Are we good Christians? Doesn't enter into the equation. Are you good Muslims? Doesn't enter into the equation. Are we a good human race? It's an absolute value. It's an end in itself. Then in it, and in it alone, would there be the ground of a possible categorical imperative. That's Kant in a nutshell. And once again, this is why Kant would be today classified as spiritual but not religious. Kant's morality is arguably impossible to define in terms of organized religion. He wants it to exist above organized religion because it's more pure than organized religion. And then he says, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Building this cooperative, diverse, mutually respectful human race is an end. Episode 7, Part 1, he talks about a lesson in lying. This is Kant's moral theory, whether it's ever acceptable to lie. It's a very good argument. I love this part of the video series. Once again, making religious parents nervous. When Immanuel Kant said, when we think of ourselves as free, we transfer ourselves into the intelligible world as members and recognize the autonomy of the will. I'm an autonomous individual, and I'm going to go into the intelligible world. And I'm going to act at a higher plane, and I'm going to never do anything that I would not be satisfied with if everybody else acted the same way. So I can't do anything of my free will unless I'm willing to accord everybody else that same autonomy to do exactly what I'm thinking of doing. And if they do that and it impacts me, then the flip side of that is, oh, then if I do it, it's going to impact them. So I can't. Because if it would have an adverse impact on me if they did it, it means that when I do it, it could have an adverse impact on them. Once again, it's hard to enforce, but it's a great idea. Episode 7, Part 2, a deal is a deal. The facts of the agreement never guarantee the fairness of it. Part 2 of this episode is really important because it sets up the idea of a contract. And the idea of a contract is critical to actually understanding John Rawls, which he introduces at the last 5 minutes. And so what Michael Sandel concludes with is this slide, which is a quote of John Rawls. And it's probably the most important slide on any of the videos. What it says is, each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. The rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or to the calculus of social interests. Michael Sandel sets up John Rawls as putting into place this kind of an argument that, you know what, there are certain things that even governments should not be able to override. It would be a breach of ethics if they did. The rights that are secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or to the calculus of social interests. And that's where we end today, and I want you to enjoy the 3 episodes, and look forward to the Sunday summaries this week. There should be a lot of good material for you to work with.